everything that I do, I kind of always have the funeral industry in the back of my mind. So I'm always like driving on a road and I see like a cross on the side of the road and I might say, I remember that death. I remember that call. Or I see someone saying, "Oh, I'm going to go cliff jumping." And in my head I'm like, I have responded to cliff jumping deaths. And now with a new baby, I just sometimes think, "Oh my gosh, I've seen this and this and this." And I kind of have to put that in the back of my mind, but also be aware that that can happen.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
All right, who's ready to talk funerals? Still there? We are going to spend the next half hour or so talking about the funeral industry. Yeah, I know it's not a topic you were dying to hear about today. Ha, little funeral joke. But I think today's interview might surprise you, along with today's interview guest. If I asked you to describe a funeral director, there is a certain image that might pop into your head. And while I don't know exactly what that image is, it is probably not the image of Darien Cain. It's not just that Cain is a young woman in an historically older male field that explains why she's so important to hear from. And it's not that she also teaches in the Funeral Services Administration Department at SUNY Canton. It's those things, plus the approach she takes to a field that is generally not filled with rainbows and unicorns. Cain brings in qualities such as social responsibility and humility to her work with funeral home clients, and she weaves in traits like empathy, innovation, and leadership into her teaching. And while she is not doing it alone, Darien Cain is helping to change the face of her profession. I am very happy to say Darien Cain joins us on the line from Watertown. Welcome. It is a delight to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
So, maybe I am stereotyping here, but I think for a long time, the image of the funeral director in TV and movies is, usually an older man, maybe a little smarmy. You don't necessarily fit that mold, but getting away from the stereotype, are there new approaches to the funeral services world that you see yourself taking that really show how the industry has changed over time?
Well, the industry has definitely changed, especially with those stereotypes. There are definitely, some people in the older generation that come into the funeral home and they expect to see that older male in a suit, sometimes like in a top hat, very kind of solemn, but very kind and compassionate. And so when people come into the funeral home and they see me, like you said, I'm not necessarily the image of what people think of when it comes to a funeral director. But as of, 2021, almost 70 to 80% of mortuary science students are women or women identifying. So there are definitely changes to the funeral industry. Now, some of the approaches that I'm taking and that I teach my students is one, to kind of break through those stereotypes. And it doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, as long as you are professional and as long as you are compassionate. Now, there are still stereotypes that are being upheld in the industry: no tattoos, no visible piercings, no crazy hair colors. And that's something that is starting to change in more progressive areas, not necessarily here in the North Country. It is still pretty conservative when it comes to the funeral industry here, but that's okay as long as you are professional and, like I said, empathetic and compassionate.
Okay, so you sit down, let's say, on an airplane, and the woman sitting in the window seat starts chatting with you, and she turns out to be, I don't know, a real estate agent or manages an office someplace, and then you tell her that you are a funeral director, and then I would be willing to bet that she asks, "How did you happen to choose this for your life's work?" So what do you tell people when they ask about it?
Oh gosh, I get that question all the time. Everyone is like, "Why would you want to work with death? Do you just want to be in the back room with dead people?" That's not what the funeral industry is. That's kind of one of the misconceptions is that we're just in the back and we're just with the dead people and we don't talk to the public. But 90% of what we do is talking to people, whether it's talking to a cemetery or a clergy member or talking to a family. So you really do have to be very personable in this industry. That's kind of a misconception. Um, but what I tell people, my story, I kind of got into funeral service a little differently than some people. So I originally went to school for biology and chemistry. In my senior year of high school, one of my family friends unfortunately died by suicide. He was a little bit younger than me in high school, and that kind of rocked our community. So I was going through the grief process for the first time while exploring my interest in biology, which led me to the world of pathology, forensic pathology. And I originally wanted to be a medical examiner. So I did intern with the medical examiner's office in Jefferson County, and it was a great experience. I did go on to finish my degree in biology and chemistry from SUNY Potsdam. And then I did try to apply to medical school and I didn't get in. I had the grades, but I'm pretty reflecting back, I'm pretty sure I didn't have the necessary medical experience that most applicants have. I wasn't working as an EMT or anything like that. I had worked, volunteered in hospice and been in the medical examiner's office, but they probably wanted more medical experience. So I ended up going over and talking to Dr. David Penepent at SUNY Canton's program. And it was kind of like, I'm interested in death care. What could I do? And he was like, join our program, which worked out because I was graduating early, had no idea what I was going to do at that point. So I ended up starting in the funeral home at Cleveland Funeral Home in Watertown, New York, where I still work. So that definitely worked out for me, and started SUNY Canton's program. Currently, I'm the fastest person to ever go through their program. I completed it in 1 year.
How long is it usually for people?
It's a 4-year bachelor's degree program.
And you did it in one.
Yes, luckily I had so many credits because when I graduated from Potsdam, I had 3 minors, so I had taken so many classes that I came in with a lot of credits, and I overloaded. And I fell in love with the funeral industry. So Cleveland Funeral Home took me in. Actually, our funeral home has the medical examiner's contract for Jefferson County. So I kind of got the best of both worlds where I've been able to work in the funeral home capacity, but I've also been able to be involved in the medical examiner side of it, and has really bolstered the experiences that I've been able to get over the last, oh gosh, 7 years now. So that's how I kind of got into the industry. And then once I got my license, then I was asked to apply to SUNY Canton as one of the instructors was retiring. And that's how I got into the teaching aspect of it. But I kind of got that roundabout way of the funeral industry wasn't necessarily what I planned to do, but I found my way to it. And I definitely think this industry is a calling, that it's not something that you necessarily set out to do unless you grew up in a funeral home, but it's something that you find your way to.
Is there, we hear a lot about the shortage of doctors and nurses in rural areas and especially in the North Country. And is there a shortage of funeral services workers in this part of the world?
There are definitely shortages everywhere. And one of the biggest reasons is because of people leaving the industry. So a very high percentage of people leave the industry within 5 years because of things like burnout and compassion fatigue, because we're working with the darkest of experiences day in and day out. We're dealing with grieving families. We are seeing sometimes the worst of humanity. When I see on the news about mass shootings and things like that, I always think about our funeral directors, who usually first responders are mentioned in the news, EMTs, fire, police who respond, but we don't really hear about the funeral directors, who are the ones that are going, and they are actually going to be working with those families. They are going to be taking care of those decedents, making them how do I put this? Making them ready for their funerals, whether that be heavy restoration and the embalming process, making it so they look normal to themselves for that family to have a lasting memory image. And that can be extremely taxing, especially when we're dealing with, infants and children, or we're dealing with people that we know and family members. It's a 24/7 industry. I have left Thanksgiving dinner to go meet with a family. I have left New Year's celebrations. I have had people come to my house and I immediately have had to leave. I've missed birthdays. So we definitely have to live out this career. It's not a typical 9 to 5. Like, you are living this every day, every minute. You are ready to go because we can't tell when someone's going to die, right? Whether it's 2 a.m. or 4 p.m., we have to go. Doesn't matter what's going on in our own lives. And in some of these small funeral homes up here in the North Country, where there's only 2 or 3 of us that are working, that's a lot of time that we are putting in outside of our own homes, outside of our own interests. And that can just be a lot for people, especially people who are new into the industry. They're 20 years old. They see their friends going out and celebrating and going on vacation and spontaneous road trips, and we can't do that. And so that can just be taxing in those first couple of years as you're finding your footing, you're making your way in the industry. A lot of older funeral directors, when you're in your residency period, as you're preparing for your licensure, a lot of older directors say, my residency was hard, so yours is going to be hard. And you get all of the tasks that we don't want to do. So that can just add so much weight and pressure and stress to funeral directors. So there is a shortage, but at the same time, when you look at funeral homes up here, a lot of the funeral homes don't have enough of a call volume to hire a lot of people, or enough revenue to hire people at a livable wage. So if you're in a bigger city, then yes, you're going to see shortages. But up here, we have enough funeral homes, it seems, that it's a little bit harder to actually find a placement because of everyone just kind of being set in their funeral homes, whether it's family owned or people have just worked there for 20, 30 years. But in bigger areas, there's definitely shortages.
I don't know if people heard this, but we occasionally have heard a crying baby behind you, and it's worth noting you are a new parent. Do you think about this kind of I don't know, juxtaposition? At one level, you're now experiencing the miracle of the beginning of a life, and at the same time, you go to work every day and you're working with people at the other end of their lifespan.
Oh gosh, yes. This industry has definitely made me look at life differently. I do try to appreciate life and family and friends and experiences so much more, because I have just seen so many people who had so much more to live and so much more to do, and their life just be cut short, whether it was an accident or purposefully or just wrong place, wrong time, which we see a lot of nowadays. Um, and everything that I do, I kind of always have the funeral industry in the back of my mind. So I'm always like driving on a road and I see like a cross on the side of the road, and I might say, I remember that death. I remember that call. Or I see someone saying, oh, I'm going to go cliff jumping. And in my head, I'm like, I have responded to cliff jumping deaths. And it kind of makes me a little bit more fearful in some ways. And now with a new baby, I just sometimes think, oh my gosh, I've seen this and this and this. And I kind of have to put that in the back of my mind, but also be aware that that can happen. Definitely, I see that change in my students as they go through the program and they start to see more and more in the funeral home. I, a lot of times, see them look at life differently by the time they graduate. And usually they are more appreciative, more empathetic, more understanding of people's struggles. And I think that it's kind of a balance of understanding what can happen and appreciating life, but not being too fearful 24/7 and being afraid to live.
I was reading about, I guess it was an award you received from SUNY Potsdam, and you also received one just recently from SUNY Canton as well. And they both point to your humility and your social conscience as things you bring with you into the funeral services field. And it sounds like maybe there's some realization, or at least in your case, a realization that you can have more than, I don't know, a transactional relationship with the families you work with. It's not just asking them which casket or which flower arrangement or which plot. How did you come to that realization that you can really bring these parts of your own personality that are so important to you to the field that you chose?
Families do not want to talk to a wall. They don't want to go into a funeral home. And I hear this all the time. I went to the funeral home and it was like hearing a car salesman and they were telling me all about the caskets. That's not what families want. Families want to feel heard and that they are the only focus of your funeral home in that moment. They don't want to feel like another case. And they don't want to even know that you have two other deaths that you're going to meet with those families later on, right? When you're meeting with that family, when you're doing that service, they are your entire focus. That moment is about them because you can't redo a funeral. We get one shot at this, and we want families to feel that we hear them, that we are working with what they want, that we are honoring and memorializing their loved one in a way that they deserve. And so for that to happen, we really have to be ourselves. Yes, we have a job to do. So there are certain regulations that we have to follow. And I know pricing is the thing that comes up. Everyone thinks that we are trying to just rob you blind. And I promise that's not the case. I promise actually a lot of funeral homes are probably losing money, but we can do that and we can uphold those standards in a way that's still compassionate and empathetic. And sometimes that means just sitting and listening to the family for an hour and you just listen to stories. I am so blessed to practice in small town upstate New York in Watertown and Chameau and Cape Vincent. I'm so blessed to practice in those areas because I've gotten to know so many people in the community. I grew up in Clayton, so I am a North Country local, but I did live above the funeral home in Chameau for about 4.5
You did.
years. And so yes. I lived at our Watertown location for about a year, and I lived at our Chameau location for about 4.5 years. And I loved it. I loved being integrated in the community. I serve on a lot of boards in the community, but I would see families that I served out at the post office, out at restaurants, and I would always have conversations with them. I have lasting relationships with lots of people that I have handled their loved ones for. And I always tell my students this story that when I was newly practicing, newly licensed, I had a relationship that ended. And actually, one of the older ladies in town who I took care of her husband, her and a couple other widows threw a dinner for me. And they called it a little widows breakup dinner. And I just loved that because I felt like I was really part of the community and they just valued how much I helped them so much that they took me under their wings and were so appreciative. And it just goes to show that they are not just a case, that we will see them through and through years later. We still get together, we still talk about their family members that they've lost, and we still make them feel that we care about them.
It's funny the way you tell that story. I could totally imagine, one of the older women saying to another, Gertie, this is that nice young woman from the funeral home.
Yes. She has introduced me that way to so many people in town. So many people around here know me as just the funeral director. But it's great because I've received calls from, old friends or relatives or people that have just heard that I'm a funeral director with questions. Even if they're not going to use my funeral home, I have no problem answering questions or helping you out or pointing you to the right direction. You might say, well, I want this service, but I want to use this funeral home. Great. And I can tell you this is what to expect, and they will help you out with that. Even though I work for a particular funeral home, I want all funeral homes to succeed. So whether you want to use me or you want to use someone else, that's fine. I will still answer whatever questions you have.
And at least this is one thing that Amazon is not doing.
Oh, you can buy a casket on Amazon. You can buy urns on
You can buy a
Amazon.
casket on Amazon?
Oh, yes, you can buy a casket from Walmart, Costco, Amazon. I don't recommend it because I can't verify the quality. And I'm sure all of us have had something show up from Walmart or Amazon that's broken. And if a casket shows up in your services tomorrow and it's broken, what are we going to do? Whereas the caskets that I sell, yes, they're probably going to be a little bit more expensive. And that's because I also have to pay for that casket, but I can guarantee the quality. And if it arrives broken, I can guarantee I can have another one within 24 hours. I can't guarantee that with Costco or Amazon. That's a purchaser's
Right.
risk, I
It's
guess.
like one thing to buy windshield wipers from Walmart, but a casket is really
Right.
I mean, it's a real purchase.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that on social media all the time. Don't buy the funeral homes urns, buy them on Amazon. Which if you want to do that, I'm never going to turn a family away. Actually, legally you can't. Legally a funeral home has to accept a third party
Really?
casket or urn if a family purchases one. But I do try to make the families aware of those risks. And I always try to say, what's a backup if something happens with that? And I encourage families, if you're buying a third party casket, to be there when it's delivered. That way you can see if it's up to the quality that you were thinking. That way you don't show up to the funeral and say, this isn't the casket that I purchased. We have no idea if you purchased it from a third party what it's supposed to look like. So just that's a disclaimer if you choose to do that.
You mentioned the COVID pandemic as one of the catalysts for some people either getting into the industry or certainly having it on their radar. It was, as we all know, a really challenging time for your industry as a whole, but especially in large cities like New York. Can you share the story of Operation Hands with a Heart? Because I gather this is one of the contributions you made to kind of the bigger nationwide effort to do something for an overwhelmed part of the industry.
Yes, so this was all coordinated by Dr. David Penapet, who was the program director for the funeral program at SUNY Canton. And him and I, along with a handful of students who volunteered, we went to New York City over the course of a month. And we transported decedents out of New York City metropolitan area funeral homes to crematories in bordering states and up here in the North Country. So we went to Pennsylvania, we went to Vermont, we went to Connecticut. We went all over New York just to mitigate the wait time. Some of those funeral homes would have 50 to 60 decedents who were waiting on cremation, but the crematories were so overwhelmed. So we developed this tracking system, and we sent vehicles and students to these funeral homes, and we coordinated and transported in the course of a month over 700 people to crematories. They were able to be cremated and returned to their families within a week. When we were doing these efforts. So that was a huge undertaking that in the grand scheme of things only did a small amount of what was needed, but over 700 people's families were able to receive their loved ones in a timely manner. Those funeral homes were able to receive assistance. Some of our students ended up staying at some of those funeral homes to help for months after. And it kind of opened the door for a lot of other funeral directors to go in and help with these efforts. And I know like the Watertown Daily Times had a couple articles about it. I believe Chad Green from Potsdam, Messina area assisted with some of those efforts. So it was a massive undertaking. Definitely not something I hope that anyone has to do again. I never thought that I would work in a pandemic or a mass casualty event. But when I was asked to go down and to help with these efforts, the first thing that came into my mind was, wow, this is what my grandfather must have felt when he went with the fire department to respond to 9/11. And to think, wow, that we had similar experiences, very, very different, but similar when it comes to responding to a very unexpected mass casualty event. I'm very honored to be able to have been part of that effort, to gain that experience, and to be able to teach my students about it. I think a lot of us learned what to do and what not to do, if this were to ever happen in the future. But I really hope that we don't ever experience something like this again.
Well, and someday you'll be telling your new baby when she is older about what your experience was like during this pandemic, and you do have it's a unique story to tell.
Yeah, I imagine it will be like when our grandparents, great grandparents who lived through like the Great
Right.
Depression and like World War II, it'll be stories like that. And you're like, I just can't believe that that happened and you survived.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, it's fascinating work that you do, and Darien Cain, I'm so grateful that you took some time to tell us about it.
Thank you for having me and for listening. I love to tell people about the funeral industry to kind of break some of those stigmas that we are not just depressed people in the back room. Many of us are very bubbly, personable people who just really want to help our community in some of the worst times.
And it's something that most of us don't realize. So it's good to meet a bubbly funeral director.
Thank you.
That is Darien Cain. She's a licensed funeral director for Cleveland Funeral Home in Watertown. She also teaches in the Funeral Services Administration program at SUNY Canton. And if that weren't enough to give her North Country bona fides, she is also a Clayton native and has degrees from both SUNY Canton and SUNY Potsdam. That is all for this episode of Northwards. Ethan Shanty is here now to share the names of the people who make this show possible.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.